Thank you very much. I just came from Telluride, Colorado, where I introduced a movie called Only the Dead. It's about Iraq, and it's probably the most violent, upsetting movie that I've ever seen. What a catastrophe Iraq was for us today, how it's affected this mass migration into Europe. So what the issues we're talking about today are very current. 60 million migrants on the move thanks to the war in Iraq. It's only going to get worse. And what we're talking about here, and this has fascinated me forever, is Saudi Arabia. I've been to Saudi Arabia. I never served there. I've never seen the 9/11 Commission classified appendices, the 28 pages. But what I can tell you is that Saudi Arabia is a country in peril. And the reason I'm bringing that up now is because we're all asking about possible motivation for some Saudis, the 15 at least, Osama bin Laden, why they felt that violence to this degree was justified. What you have to do is, as I saw in this movie, is look into the minds of the people who attacked the United States, the way they look at the world. And especially more recently. If you're a Sunni Muslim and you're looking at the state of the Middle East, they've lost 4 capitals to the Shia, their sworn enemies. Baghdad, Beirut is run by Hezbollah, Sana'a, and what's the 4th one? There we go. Damascus, of course, is if you consider Alawite Shia. So you have a civilization that feels it's on the brink. Saudi Arabia is at war in Yemen because it truly feels its existence is at stake. If you're a true believer, it's an apocalyptic situation now where the world is coming apart. And if you lived in the Middle East and if you looked at reports today about the Islamic State making a lot more chemical weapons, it is. Currently, Saudi Arabia, and I'd like to get into the current politics is because it puts in perspective 9/11. You have a country which I don't think can exist much longer as is. Saudi Arabia is an artificial country. It was founded in 1932. The Hijaz and the Nejd are completely, it's like Mexico and the United States. They're completely different. You've got an army that is led by a 29-year-old Mohammed bin Salman. He's young, he's inexperienced, he's unsteady, just as I was at 29. He runs oil, he runs finance, he's writing all the decrees. And on top of that, you have a lot of Wahhabi Muslims that are seriously upset. I mean, if you are a Sunni Muslim and you look at the 2003 war, it looks like we invaded Iraq to dispossess the Sunnis. The Sunnis are in dire straits in Iraq. A lot of those Sunnis in Ramadi are related to the Saudis, the same tribal confederation. They look at the world as a conspiracy against Sunni Islam. The same people who boarded those planes on 9/11 also, in a very conspiratorial way, looked at the world as reaching apocalyptic disaster for the Sunnis, whether it's the United States support for Israel, whether it's we drew the Saudis into the war in Afghanistan. They got absolutely nothing out of it. But more than that, these people they made a bad bargain with the West. Liberal economics, liberal societies, democracies have gotten them nothing. And what happens when you have a civilization like Saudi Arabia, and especially people that are not particularly well educated, and they think their existence is under threat, they develop a herd mentality. And any time a herd mentality in a society occurs, it stampedes. You have to look at 9/11 as these people are striking back against overwhelming force. I spent years in Israeli prisons talking to the Hamas prisoners, or the suicide bombers that failed, and the Islamic Jihad. It was all the same sort of mentality where these people are striking out. So what I'm getting at here is, for a lot of people, it's inconceivable that America's best ally in the Arab Peninsula, Saudi Arabia, would possibly anybody in that country would look at us as an enemy. But you have to look at the context of the enemy, the way they look at the world. You also have to consider that terror works. The United States was driven out of Iraq with car bombs, drove the UN out, drove the Allies out.
False flag terror really works.
Yeah. Terror is efficient. You look at terror against the regime in Baghdad. You look at terror against the Islamic State, dropping chemical bombs. It works, and none of this is new in the sense that the French were driven out of Algeria. And so what we're seeing today is an apocalyptic war. 9/11 was at the start of this. And I have a hard time believing in conspiracies, but what really disturbs me is these 28 pages have not been made public. Perhaps there's nothing in them. Perhaps there's a smoking gun. But just like the Kennedy assassination, you have to get this stuff out. I can tell you the nature of the intelligence in the report, and it'd be very easy for the FBI and the Central Intelligence Agency to clean that up. But this administration, as the last administration, does not want to deal with the truth because they don't believe we can handle it. But if we're going to go into another war or take sides in the Middle East, the only thing we can do is see the evidence. Otherwise, we're going to be drawn into another Iraq. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Senator Bob Graham is the former chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee and the co-chairman of the 2002 Joint Congressional Inquiry into the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Elected to the Florida State House of Representatives in 1966, he was a member of the Florida State Senate from 1970 to 1978, then governor of Florida from 1979 to 1986, then was elected as a Democrat to the United States Senate in 1986, where he served 3 terms. He's the author of the suspense novel, Keys of the Kingdom. Ladies and gentlemen, Senator Bob Graham.
Thank you, Ian, Bob, and thank you for coming this evening and giving us an opportunity to talk about what I think is one of the most under-discussed, most important issues facing our nation. At the first hearing of the Commission on the Inquiry into 9/11, the first witness was Mrs. Christine Breitweiser. Her husband, Ronald, had died in the World Trade Center. These were the words that she used to tell us why she thought the inquiry that we were starting was so important. All we have are tears and a resolve to find the answers, because we continue to look into the eyes of our young children who ask us, why? We have an obligation as parents and as a nation to provide these innocent children with answers as to why their mother or their father never returned home. There are stark, unanswered questions remaining now after almost 14 years after 9/11. Those questions include, did the 19 hijackers act alone, or did they have facilitators within the United States who made their plot successful? The official position of your government is that they acted alone, and all efforts to provide the information that would challenge that assumption have thus far been frustrated. 2, if there were facilitators, to what extent was Saudi Arabia one of those facilitators, and what was the depth and the form of its assistance? And three, why would our ally of many decades facilitate the 19 hijackers? And finally, why has the United States government, through 2 administrations, gone to such lengths to cover up and now engage in aggressive deception to keep this information from the American people? What we do know about the Saudi role is primarily from where we are sitting tonight and south. The first 2 of the 19 hijackers entered the country in mid-January 2000 through Los Angeles International Airport. A week after they had arrived, a man by the name of Omar Bayoumi met with them. Bayoumi was a bookkeeper by training, had worked for the Saudi Arabia Civilian Aviation Authority. In the mid-1990s, the Saudi government became concerned about the possibility of a civil insurrection led by young Saudis of college and university age, the same age that had led the revolt in Iran in 1979. In order to monitor the activities of this age group, the Saudis established an organization of persons who were responsible for various regions within Saudi Arabia and around the world to watch over the Saudi students. Omar Bayoumi had the responsibility to do that in Southern California, living in San Diego. Bayoumi, in the 3rd week in January, came to Los Angeles and met with a man who Ian has already referred to, Fahad Thumari, who was a consular in the Saudi Arabian consul in Los Angeles, with a particular responsibility for dealing with cultural and religious issues. Bayoumi met with Fahad Thumari for an hour. We do not know what that hour of conversation led to, again, because the sources of that information continue to be classified. We do know that as soon as the meeting was over, Bayoumi and his driver went to a Middle Eastern restaurant in Los Angeles. At that time, there were 134 Middle Eastern restaurants in Los Angeles. They selected one and ended up sitting at a table next to 2 younger men who were speaking Arabic with a Saudi accent. And in what they said was a spirit of hospitality, they invited these 2 younger men to sit at their table. As it turned out, the 2 younger men were the 2 hijackers who had entered the United States through Los Angeles International Airport a few days earlier. Bayoumi encouraged the 2 men to relocate from Los Angeles to San Diego, stating that he would provide them with assistance should they elect to do so. They did, and he did. He provided them with a place to live in his own apartment initially, and then selected and paid for an apartment into which they moved. He provided them with flight lessons, which turned out to be futile. The flight instructor described the 2 future hijackers as being dumb and dumber in terms of their aviation skills. And he provided them, maybe most importantly, with a network of respected and elderly Saudis who lived in San Diego, who provided them with anonymity. The That's it's all right. the source of Bayomi's finances was a job that he held with a Saudi-based civilian engineering firm, and for which he was never expected to show up. He was referred to as the ghost employee. As soon as he arrived, as soon as the two hijackers arrived in San Diego, his allowances went up by eightfold, creating the inference that he was using these additional funds to finance the two hijackers. That was not all that he had done. He had also become the recipients of funds which amounted to something in excess of $50,000 from the embassy of Saudi Arabia in Washington. That embassy had a practice of providing funds for Saudis in the United States who were in some form of financial distress. They had been providing this to a woman who lived in San Diego. As soon as the hijackers arrived, the check stopped going to her and started to go to the Bayomi family, again creating the inference that that was a source of support for the two hijackers. You in Southern California cannot claim the sole example of Saudi engagement. We have our own in Sarasota. There was a prominent Saudi family which had lived in Sarasota, Florida, for 6 years. In 2000, 3 of the to-be hijackers began doing their flight training at a small school near Sarasota and were spending an increasing amount of time with this Saudi family. 10 days before 9/11, the Saudi family left under what were described as urgent conditions, i.e. a new car in the front of the house, food on the table, clothes in the washer. The FBI conducted an investigation of this relationship and determined and made a public statement to the effect that there was had been a complete investigation conducted, that investigation had determined no connections between the 3 hijackers and the Saudi family, and that they had made all of that information available to those commissions that were investigating 9/11. Well, as the co-chair of the Congressional Commission, I knew I had never been alerted to the fact that there was this relationship in Sarasota. I talked to the 2 chairs of the Citizens 9/11 as to whether they had been informed, and they said they had not been informed. So I began to ask the FBI when, where, under what file number had they provided us with this information so we could go back into our files. 45 days later, they had no information, the FBI, that would lead us to the documents that were stated to have been made available to us. I did have the opportunity to read 2 of the investigative reports by the FBI agent in charge, in which he stated that the investigation was incomplete, that there were significant leads that had not been fully followed, and that he had found many connections between the hijackers and the prominent Saudi family. All that information has now been classified, and the FBI, when faced with a Freedom of Information Act stated that they could not comply because there were no documents gathered about the situation in Sarasota. The federal judge found that to be incredulous and asked them to go back and look further. And they said, well, they had found some documents, but that there was an issue of privacy Well, I don't know whether they were talking about the privacy of the 3 dead hijackers or the privacy of the Saudi family that had gone back to Riyadh, but in any event, again, they resisted releasing any information. Finally, the judge persisted further, and they said, we are going to give you all the information that we have on the investigations that were conducted in Sarasota, and provided the judge, after having initially said there were no documents, 80,000 pages of documents that had been developed in this investigation. The judge still, as of today, the eve of the 14th anniversary of 9/11, is reviewing those 80,000 pages, and hopefully soon will make a judgment as to which can be released to the public. I think it is an outrage that in all of these instances that the public has been denied the right to know, that the very thing that Ms. Breitmeister had said gave her some comfort was the fact that she would someday be able to answer to her children why her husband had been violently killed. There are some things that you can do that would help move this process forward. The most visible of the not to be released information are those 28 pages which primarily talk about the role of Saudi Arabia in financing 9/11. There is an effort underway in the Congress to pass a resolution which would urge the president, who has the authority, to release those 28 pages. I would ask you to send an email or a telephone call or however you communicate to your own member of Congress and ask, has he read the 28 pages? Because members of Congress, including my daughter, who is now a first-term member of Congress, who said she was shocked when she read the 28 pages, are allowed to do so. And then having read it and appreciating its importance, would they then sign this resolution urging the president to release this? I have heard some members of Congress say, we're not prepared to commit the time even to read 28 pages because we think this is old news, it's stale, nobody cares about it. Well, I think the American people do care about it. I think they care about it for a number of reasons. One is justice. Ms. Breitmeister and 6,000 other wives, husbands, fathers, mothers of the victims of 9/11 have been in federal court suing Saudi Arabia as essentially a co-conspirator. The law, when a foreign government is sued in a U.S. court, requires a fairly heavy showing of the likelihood of success before the litigation can proceed. The frustrating thing for those 6,000 Americans is that there is compelling evidence that Saudi Arabia was a co-conspirator, but their government is withholding it from them. So doing justice to American families who've suffered grievously is an additional reason. A second reason is I think that while one of the reasons given for withholding is that it would be adverse to our national security to release all this information about the Saudi role, I think just the opposite. I think the following 3 truths are self-evident. One, the Saudis know what they did. The Saudis have good reason to believe that at least at the highest levels, the United States government knows what they did. And 3, the Saudis have observed how the United States has reacted to Truth 1 and 2. And they have seen that even though they were a participant in the most grievous attack inside the United States since at least Pearl Harbor, that there has been no sanction, no response. There was no president going before Congress and saying that December 7th, 1941 will be a day that will live in infamy, and we then declared war on Japan. We have done none of those things that indicate our national outrage at this violation against our nation and against our people. That lack of response, that passivity and impunity, I think has encouraged Saudi Arabia to continue to provide funding for its legacy organizations such as Al-Qaeda and new organizations such as ISIS. But even more so, it has encouraged them to expand their network of mosques and madrasas, which preach violence, intemperance, and jihad, and serve as a constant supply of new recruits into terrorist organizations. So, friends, if we are going to be faithful to the commitment that Ms. Breitmeister made of why it is important that we tell the truth to the American people, we must cease this ill-advised policy of trying to protect the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia from the responsibility that it truly holds, and you as citizens can play a role in assuring that that happens. Thank you.
So now in terms of the person who obviously believes they know everything about 9/11, I don't know why you're even here, because you already have all the facts. The senator is somebody that was the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee at the time of the 9/11, so I would suggest that maybe he has some things that he could tell us, and perhaps he knows what's in the 28 pages, and certainly his daughter does. So can we just have an evening where our guests, we get as much information out of our guests as possible, rather than listen to people who feel they have cornered the truth. So so let me start with you, Bob. When you say the kingdom's cracking up, would the divisions be between the modernists, if you will, like Nayef, who apparently has been sidelined, Mohammed bin Nayef, and the others, the Wahhabis, which this 29 or 30-year-old kid who's really running the kingdom apparently is a hardliner? Is that the dichotomy?
He's a hardliner, but you have to look at this as it's a personal succession in the kingdom. And Mohammed bin Salman, the defense minister, is 29 to 30 years old. He's the favorite son of the king. The king, when he was governor of Riyadh, was very close to Al-Qaeda, the Wahhabis. The Saudi royal family depended upon, and at the same time feared, the Wahhabis. The Wahhabis have come out of the deep desert. They, for instance, since they took over Mecca, have razed the city. Any ancient artifacts, just like Palmyra, were knocked down. Even the sites where the Prophet had lived and resided were torn down. It's a very strict religion, and they look at the West as hostile to Islam, and it's very apocalyptic. And this young man is conducting a war in Yemen, and as you know, he's tearing down the old city with bombs, with F-16s, simply because Yemen, the Saudis feel, is a threat to their civilization, and this war is moving up. So this has really been an ongoing trauma for Saudi Arabia that really goes back to its founding in 1932, where it feels very, very defensive. And I'm not apologizing for the Wahhabis. I just want to get inside their head. And what the Saudi royal family has to do in order to hold on to the kingdom is they cannot alienate people who truly believe in what they're doing and that believe that they're in an apocalyptic struggle. And we're here to talk about evidence of Saudi Arabia involved in 9/11. That, of course, Senator Graham knows much, much more than I do. But I'm just trying to provide the background. And what really concerns me now, however you feel about Saudi Arabia, is the kingdom could collapse. If the price of oil continues to fall, subsidies will end. There will be more dissent. There's a feeling among Saudis that the royal family betrayed them. I mean, how did the royal family, let me go back to Iraq, allow the United States to disenfranchise the Sunnis? That the royal family has sold out to the United States. So again, I'm parsing of where they're coming and how is it possible that these radicals, Takfiris, could strike at the United States. And what's going to happen, just to finish very quickly, it's going to get worse. So we're talking about 60 million immigrants on the move into Europe. If this conflict continues and we don't do anything about it, and I'm very much an isolationist, but things are so bad now, you're going to have 120 immigrants heading toward Europe, 120 million.
So, Senator, I may have mischaracterized the fact that I thought you had read the pages since they were generated by your committee. You have read it, right? But like the priest in the confessional, you can't tell us. But your daughters read them, and I understand a lot of other congressmen and women have read them. And from what I've been told by the people who've read them, they say that's completely shocked them and changed their entire perspective on what happened. Is that an accurate depiction of the impact that these 28 pages have had on those that have read them?
Yes, the 28 pages, as I said, are primarily about the financing of 9/11, and they point a very strong finger of condemnation at Saudi Arabia. And I believe that persons who are first-time readers of this information and have lived through the last 14 years in which Saudi Arabia's role has increasingly receded into the background are stunned at the facts of how engaged Saudi Arabia was, and almost to a person have then signed this resolution of discharge to the president urging that he release the 28 pages.
But then you have to ask yourself, I know the Saudis have lots of money. They spend their money on Capitol Hill largely on public relations, and they operate somewhat differently from, say, the AIPAC lobby that has a more hands-on relationship with the Congress itself. Why, though, are our leaders so acquiescent to this? Is it simply that this is this relationship that goes back to FDR on the cruiser with meeting with Ibn Saud, that the deal is that you get to run your kingdom, do anything you like, we're not going to bother you, but just keep the oil flowing?
The answer is they're hiding the other couple.
I think I don't.
No, wait a second. Well,
There have been a number of speculations about that. Some of them relate to the special family relationship between the Bush family and the Saud family, which goes back now 3 generations. Others to that World War II agreement in which the Saudis essentially said, we'll provide you with a reliable source of petroleum if you'll provide us with security. What's hard for me to understand is why President Obama has continued the policies essentially of the Bush administration, particularly in his campaign, where he certainly gave many people, including myself, the impression that he would be more open. And some of the members of the families of the victims have said that they were told by the president that this information would be released. So I'm in a quandary as to why Obama is continuing this. I think the suggestion that you made, that they just feel that the situation in the Middle East is so fractious now that to throw additional no pun intended, oil on the fire would have consequences that they're unwilling to be put in a position of having to deal with. Bob's maybe.
We have to look at that. They have provided Saudi Arabia cheap oil, and the 5 last recessions are all caused by the high price of oil, and it's unthinkable for us as Americans with the president for Saudi Arabia to collapse when you're losing 25-30% of the world's reserves is gone in some sort of conflict. We are going to be in a lot of trouble, even with fracking today. Saudi Arabia is another problem, is an opaque country. We saw the results of 9/11 on the ground, but there's nobody that has ever gotten inside the royal family to understand what they're thinking. The Saudis do not confide with Americans, with American ambassadors, with American intelligence. Our intelligence on Saudi Arabia, frankly, is abysmal. I've been through the files for 20 years, and it's just not there. We do not know what makes that country tick. And I think the president knows that, and he's afraid that if he opens his can of worms on 9/11, where does it stop? And I can understand it politically. Yeah, it's a mess. I mean, but the problem is, I totally agree with you, is the fact that we had all this bogus intelligence before 2003, and if we keep on peddling bogus intelligence or withhold forensics from that attack on 9/11, the American people are going to lose complete trust in the government, and where does it go from there?
Have any of you spent from 9 to 11 this week watching the new version of Ken Burns' Civil War? I thought it was a stunning revival of that series. There was an instance in there which talked about the fear that Abraham Lincoln had that either England or France, both of which had significant financial relationships with the South, particularly purchase of agricultural products like cotton, would bolt and recognize the Confederacy as being a sovereign government, which might have had the effect of terminating the war and the United States fracturing and being a totally different nation than we know it to be today. But Lincoln had an even higher level of concern over the American people, where he felt that the way their support for this increasingly violent and bloody war would be maintained would be if they were assured that they, the American people, knew everything about what was happening. And so he directed his departments of government, such as the State Department, to release on a daily basis all information that they had gathered or disseminated about the state of the war. That included releasing some information which upset the English and the French. But he thought the higher value was maintaining the confidence of his own people, and transparency was a key to doing that. Where is Abraham Lincoln when we need him?
Well, just a final question then, because we need to go to Q&A. Obviously, this deal with Iran has got the Saudis freaked out, it's got the Israelis freaked out. Is it possible, I mean, first of all, militarily, that makes no sense that, Israel can wipe Iran off the map. It's not the other way around. So the arguments about the bomb are obviously a smokescreen. The real issues, from my understanding, is, one, the Israelis don't like the idea that the U.S. might have some choices in the Middle East and not have to go through them. And two, the possibility that there may be a recognition, and maybe Bob can address this too, that at the end of the day, you might be better off dealing with the Shia. And if you combine Iran's oil with Iraq's oil, and Iraq's got huge reserves, then maybe you don't need the dependence on Saudi Arabia. So is that what the subtext of the insecurity that the Saudis are feeling now, apart from the fact that the country may be falling apart in any case?
Well, I think this is, but Bob inferred that one question I might be better prepared to answer. I know this is what that he would be better prepared to answer. But I think that if this agreement, which now it appears is going to go through, becomes the opening to a broader relationship between the West and the United States and Iran, I think it does shift the balance of power in the Middle East, and particularly if you add to that Bob's prophecy that the kingdom of Saudi Arabia may be in the process of imploding, that would fully transform the Middle East and its geopolitical relationships.
I think the agreement with Iran is going to make Saudi Arabia's paranoia much deeper. I think even if we're not talking to Iran about the politics of Iraq and Syria, and as this war in Yemen continues to get worse, and as the Islamic State continues to expand, we're heading toward the abyss. And until we sit down and take Iraq and Syria and admit they don't exist anymore and partition them, that both the Shia and the Sunni are protected, is really the only way out of this catastrophe that's around the corner.
So let's go to questions here. Is there reason to believe that the Israelis knew about or facilitated the hijackers?
I know of no evidence. I know of no evidence that would support that proposition.
Bob? No, okay. I heard those refugees coming to the U.S. Well around 40,000 or so. Any thoughts about that? Can you elaborate more?
I think the United States can assimilate refugees from the Middle East much better than the Europeans. I spent 3 years assigned to France, and I still live there part of the time. And France, I can tell you, cannot assimilate millions of people from the Middle East. They've been unable to assimilate 5 million people from North Africa in 70 years, so why would they be able to do it now? It's a non-starter. The same way with the Germans have been unable to assimilate Turkish immigrants, so why would they be able to assimilate millions of Syrians and Iraqis? I think it's just insane. I mean, it's not going to work. I mean, I'm totally sympathetic to, I spent years in Syria. I love the Syrians. I married in Syria the first time. I love the place. But that's not an issue. It's an issue of what do you do when people are moving out of the Middle East. You have the Arabian aquifer is truly drying up. Global warming and conflict will be mass migrations of people. At some point, that Islam and the terrorism is going to be completely irrelevant. It's going to be just the sheer, numbers of people moving, the demographics that worries me, and fascism in Europe.
Who were the Saudis flown out of the U.S. on 9/12, and who were they, and why were they flown out?
Well, within 24 hours of 9/11, Prince Bandar, the then Saudi Arabian ambassador to the United States, requested and was granted a private visit with the president. Bandar said to the president that he was concerned that as the American people became more aware of the number of Saudis, 15 out of 19, that were involved in the attack, and some of the growing suspicions about other Saudi involvement, that there would be a backlash against Saudis living in the United States. He asked the president if he could charter an aircraft and fly the Saudi elite out of the United States. An interesting thing was where do you think that plane flew from? No. Where? No. Actually, the plane flew from Lexington, Kentucky. What do you know about Lexington, Kentucky? There were more elite Saudis in Lexington because the first weeks of September are also the horse sales than any other place in the country. And there were somewhere between 145 and 160 persons on the airplane. Originally, it was stated that the FBI had vetted the manifest and determined that there were no people on the plane that were of interest. After the flight had taken off, they said, no, we did not say that in fact there were people we would have liked to have talked to, including several members of the bin Laden family.
Here's a question for you, Senator. What would happen to you legally if you revealed what you know about those classified 28 pages?
I have made a number of commitments to my wife, one of which is I will do nothing that will send me to Leavenworth, Kansas, and I don't intend to find out the answer to that question.
And to you, Bob, how does the Saudi government benefit from a violent attack on the USA? Are we not close allies?
You know, Saudi Arabia benefits in the sense that we have ignored the Middle East at the expense of the Arabs, expense of Muslims, and for Israel. And they feel this great sense of injustice that if we would only look at the situation in the Middle East and we could bring it's Palestinians were the same way, you know, bring the conflict to the United States and we would come to our senses. That obviously it was, you know, the law of unintended consequences, and there's sheer anger. You know, I'm going back and I sound like I'm not an apologist at all, but Ambassador Robert Ford said, for every Osama bin Laden or Ayman al-Zawahiri, 50 people are joining the Islamic State driven by anger, not ideology. I agree with that. There's this hate, this visceral hate for the West, democracy, capitalism, and they look at us at the center of it, and the people politically are not sophisticated enough to really understand the complexity of the world, and they strike out. And again, I go back to this whole idea of a herd mentality. It's a stampede. And it's not that these people are, the worst word in the world is to use evil in this. It's a complexity that we fail to understand, and they thought they would level the playing fields. I mean, clearly it was a psychopathic act, but that's what they believed.
In a further parallel with Pearl Harbor, did not President Bush know of the attack in advance, as FDR did, and keep it secret with the intent of creating an incident provoking a desired war?
Again, we developed no evidence that indicated that he or anyone in his administration was aware of the specifics. There was evidence that, in fact, a CIA briefing that was given to the president shortly before 9/11 discussed the increasing likelihood of such an event, including the likelihood that it would be committed by the use of commercial airliners. But I don't think that anyone in a decision-making position knew what, when, and where the event was going to occur.
I have a question for the senator. I'm just fascinated by this. There were 50 CIA people were aware the two hijackers came to San Diego in January 2000. Why is it that of those 50, everybody got promoted?
That is one of the
and
most.
They didn't tell the FBI.
Yeah. In our commission report, we had a series of recommendations, and one of those was that the agencies that had been found to have performed in an unacceptable manner, which would have included both the FBI and the CIA, should have a process of sanctioning those individuals who were responsible for that behavior. Virtually none of that, in fact, not only virtually none of that occurred, which I think much in the way that our failure to respond to the information about the Saudi role has created a sense of impunity that within our own agencies, the fact that there are no sanctions for intolerable behavior sends a signal that the standards to which you will be held are not very high.
And that was the same with the invasion of Iraq. They used bogus intelligence, and no one paid a price.
What do you see our actions towards Saudi Arabia going? What do you see our actions to Saudi Arabia towards Saudi Arabia going to be if the 28 pages go public? Just a suit in the U.S. courts or possibly the International Court of Justice?
I think one of the results will certainly be that this current litigation will go forward, and once the plaintiffs are able to meet that threshold test of probability, then they will have access to all the discovery of calling witnesses, putting them under oath, etc., access to documents. That will open the floodgates to much more information. As to the other consequences, you can speculate, but cannot precisely enumerate. But I believe in the intelligence and good judgment of the American people, and I will be prepared to support the outcome of letting the American people read the material, form judgments, use their capacity to influence decision makers, and I think the course of that action will be enormously superior to the course that we are currently taking, whereby placating the Saudis, we're encouraging even more bad behavior.
Why are the Saudis continuing to keep the amount of oil on the market high? Shouldn't they be cutting output to support higher prices to stabilize their finances?
It's market. They want to keep market share. It's an old policy, been around for decades. They also want to drive the frackers out. And the best chance they have against causing trouble in Iran is keeping the oil price low, because the Iranians' high unemployment, their economy's in serious trouble. And they've got the reserves to go on, but it's mainly about fracking. It's really bothered them because they have to be the world's main supplier of oil. And if they lose that position, they lose their political influence.
But now that apparently the prices are dropping because demand in China is dropping, they've got a losing hand.
This is the catastrophe, because if they run out of reserves, and Saudi Arabia is a country that depends on subsidies, and for subsidizing the tribes, subsidizing a high unemployed youth, and the rest of it. So the price of oil is good for us, but it's bad for the stability of the Middle East and ultimately Saudi Arabia.
Is a normalized relationship with Shia Iran a precursor to opening up on the truth vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia?
I've got something, what we have to keep in mind is we're not just talking about the truth about 9/11, we're talking about the truth of what happened to Karbala in 2007, where the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps executed 5 Americans. That was out of orders from Tehran. That was not an accident. It's over and over again, or Bob Levinson, the FBI agent who disappeared in Iran. It's the government keeps on covering up truths that they don't want us to know because it makes their life difficult. I mean, the Iranians were killing Americans in Iran in Iraq for a decade, and we don't want to talk about it. The EFPs, those explosively formed projectiles, and we even go back to the USS Liberty. Where's the report on that? 1967. I'm still waiting for that. We just don't see it. And having been in the CIA, I understand secrecy. You have to protect sources and methods, but there comes a point when a lot of this intelligence can simply be put out without harming anybody or anything.
Okay. Senator Graham, would President Obama's could President Obama order the declassification of the 28 pages?
Yes.
Okay. Bob Baer, what is your opinion of Edward Snowden's motivations? I'm not sure. What to do with
You
that.
know, it's Edward Snowden's like sort of when your mother-in-law drives your new Cadillac off a cliff. Well, you know, it's not a good metaphor. I'm sorry, but it's. Look, you know, the warrantless wiretaps were unnecessary. I think it's like torture. Torture doesn't work. Running algorithms through every phone call in the United States and collecting this data hasn't worked, according to the FBI. It hasn't stopped anybody. Yet, as a former intelligence officer, when I see secrets that some of them I never even had access to released, it is not a good way to go. I frankly think that the committees should have been deeper involved in this and ultimately should have passed the judgment on this rather than all of us knowing. I think the warrantless wiretaps were, you know, again, it undermines confidence. So I'm divided on Snowden.
What is the story about the bin Laden family was allowed to exit USA? Truth or not?
As I said earlier, there were members of the bin Laden family on that plane that left Lexington, Kentucky 3 days after 9/11.
An alternative to relieve the growing refugee issue and lack of policy in the region, what is the possibility of creating secure, demilitarized zones and have Syrians return to these zones to live, similar to the way Kurdistan is in Iraq?
I think that's the only way is secure zones. You have to make people secure in the Middle East. They have to have water. They have to have a form of income. And if this you know, the Pandora's box of sectarianism has opened and we're not putting it back in, and this may require dividing up Iraq and Syria and other countries. But again, I go back to a year ago, I was a complete isolationist, and I think that the world has to step in the Middle East and set up these secure zones, absolutely.
So, Senator Graham, does the United States complicity or appeasement of this Islamic regime trace back to the Saudis' nationalization of U.S.-discovered oil, or farther back, or more recently? And it's worth noting that when the Chevron engineers were caught in the desert and brought to Ibn Saud's court, his translator was Harry St. John Philby, the father of the spy, Kim Philby. And the king thought, my God, they're looking for water, how great. And then they said, no, it's oil. And then the king just asked Philby, who do I give the deal to? The British, who are our normal partners, or the Americans? And Kim Philby's father said, make the deal with the Americans because they will just take the oil and they won't impose their government on you, whereas the British will want you to have a parliament one day. And so what the father gave to the West, the son took away. One of the great ironies of history. Anyway, I should shut up and let you answer the question.
What you know, it's more than oil. Let's not forget the Cold War. We needed the Saudis in the Cold War. We needed the Saudis to fund and arm the Afghan Mujahideen against the Red Army. They were our allies, and we just said, here, you know, fund who you want, send, and we. Yeah, well, they did it. They ultimately went for Hikmatyar and the Haqqani network for the Wahhabis, but we just turned a blind eye during Afghanistan. I was part of that. We just didn't. No one asked the question. Let the Pakistanis do it, the ISI and Saudi Arabia, and that's what we got. And that's how we got bin Laden. It was in the context of the Cold War, where all we cared about was beating the Soviet Union, and we did beat them. But look what we have now.
Which current presidential candidate is most likely to declassify the 28 pages?
Rand Paul is leading the effort in the Senate to declassify, so I would make him the #1 candidate.
So how are we doing on the time? We have to close up at 9. So what's the time? Oh, good. Oh, good. Let's keep going. I'm done. Okay. why aren't the Saudis taking in more Syrian refugees?
I guess that's true of all of the Gulf countries, that other than taking persons in as workers rather than as refugees, they have taken almost no persons who've been displaced by the current disruption in the Middle East. I think that's a reflection of their closed society, their insularity, and some of the
insecurities.
Yeah.
You have to remember that Syria was the Muslim Brotherhood after Egypt followed there, and they don't know what they're up against with the Syrians. And they're very worried about the Muslim Brothers in the UAE, Bahrain, and the rest of it. They've had some big trials there. And taking Levantine migrants at this would make them more unstable.
If and when the 28 pages are declassified, what is our next step? I am no fan of Saudi Arabia, but I am sure and I'm sure many others in this auditorium aren't in the mood to start yet another land war in the Middle East.
Well, I personally think that the release of the 28 pages is of such importance for the reasons that we've talked about, that we should do it under any conditions. But given the fact that there is a growing sense that the kingdom is now facing the potential of collapse, that we should see this within that broader context. The United States has an interest in the kingdom of Saudi Arabia collapsing softly and not crashing. And to date, I think there's been almost no policy attention to that possibility. Increasingly, Bob would say a probability or almost a certainty, and what that means to United States policy and to what degree we have the ability to influence the nature of the collapse. But I would say that for our own national purposes, we should release the 28 pages. For our own national purposes, we should also be engaged in trying to make the end of the Saudi kingdom of Saud as soft a landing as possible.
And another question along the lines of the idea that the Bush and Cheney regime were evil geniuses who planned that 9/11 attacks in order to rescue their failed presidency. Don't you think all a part of the plan was to promote a never-ending war that Dick Cheney orchestrated?
I mean, you may not like Dick Cheney, but I don't think that he is back there in the book of Revelations, inflicting permanent hell and damnation on all of humanity. Some of you may disagree with that assessment. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that's the whole point. There are 1 million dead Iraqis. And I want to answer that. I was just with some Marines in Colorado, and they feel.
I spoke for the dead. I'm done being a schmuck while you guys cover up mass murder. I'm done. Bye. This is a diversion from the arms of September 11th. Did the Saudis sponsor the anthrax from the U.S. weapons lab that went to your Democratic senators?
No. The Saudis have Elvis, I tell you. They've got him in a crypt.
Israeli nationals in the white vans with the explosives on 9/11?
No, what?
But anyway, you were going to talk about this.
Well, I mean,
here's
here's the problem. Anytime you have an event like 9/11, you have like the white van. Yes, there was an Israeli white van but it left the city after the first tower was struck. This, about the high-fiving and the rest of it. I've talked to the FBI guys about this. it was odd. Around the Kennedy assassination, there are odd things. But this is the whole point on the 28 pages, is rational people have to make up their minds. And about the white van, the FBI investigated, and those people did not, weren't waiting for those planes to hit the Israelis. It's that conspiracy doesn't hold up. And I don't know that the Saudi conspiracy will hold up, but I won't feel settled until I actually see the paper, which I know can be declassified because we're all smart enough to figure it out. And I used to, the white van, they were supposed to be, shin. No, there was no explosives. Oh, well, let me put it this way: as the truth is, I know it. If there were explosives found there, it's these. I don't lie.
All right. Let's not try and focus on our guests' opinions rather than the
It's all wrapped up in new policy regarding the Saudis.
okay.
This isn't about 9/11 truth.
All right. Okay.
Especially you, Bob.
Thank you. No, but I mean this is a serious discussion because we in order to
Thank you.
in order to get rid of the
Thing about this. Hello.
bye.
Bye.
This is really good because in order to get rid of the conspiracy theories, it's very crucial for Americans to deal with the fact, and you just get rid of them. I used to run conspiracies. I didn't do a very good job at it, and I don't, and if this, we really do have to get to the bottom of these things. It's absolutely crucial. Let's get those 28 pages out, and we can sit down here again and figure out what they mean.
What about the relationship to the first bombing to the second?
Ian, why don't you demand order?
Okay. I'm not being macho enough. Is that being too passive?
It's an Australian conspiracy. That's
Yeah,
what it
there
is.
you go. All right. Is there an immediate threat to the safety of Americans if the 28 pages of information are released? Is there a threat for more 9/11 scenarios?
No. There's no immediate threat to the United States by letting the American people know the truth and form an opinion. That's one of the fundamental principles of a government of, by, and for the people, is that the people not only deserve to, but our system requires that they be given the information upon which they can make informed judgments, and with those informed judgments, influence better policy.
To both gentlemen, as mentioned, the Obama administration knows about Saudi involvement in 9/11. Do you think whether there should be any long-term plan for substituting Saudi oil with Iranian oil or Iraqi oil and eventually diminishing the relationship with the Saudis?
Well, we're doing a pretty good job of substituting American oil for Saudi oil. I was on the co-chaired the commission that did the investigation on the BP oil spill. At that time, which was only 5 years ago, the United States was using about 20 million barrels of oil a day, of which 11 million were coming from abroad and 9 million were domestic. Today, those numbers have reversed and are moving rapidly to a substantially greater percentage of domestically produced oil. So I don't think that we're going to be in a position of having to decide which foreign oil we want to rely on. We are approaching that long-sought goal of being relatively energy independent, particularly if you define our region as being North America.
To Mr. Baer, throughout tonight you have highlighted the causation of Islamic terrorism due to anger and tribalism. However, as the Syrian civil war shows, the sectarian violence between groups in the Middle East has roots in the Sykes-Picot Agreement. What role do you think the consequences of Western imperialism held in inspiring and causing Islamic terrorism?
Exactly, that's it. It goes back to Sykes-Picot, Mark Sykes. It was absolutely disastrous the way the Ottoman Empire was carved up. No, the British substituted nationalism that they didn't understand. They completely misunderstood the lines. They knew Sykes knew nothing about the Middle East. He traveled there a lot. The French had a different agenda. They were dividing up the various sects. These borders are unsustainable. The only borders that are really fixed have been in history are Iran's. I think we can all go back to 1917, and that's where all the problems were. It's problems of imperialism. It was a mess. I really read this book, A War to End All War. It's all written there, beautifully written, and what the question is whether it's fixable. How do you fix those borders now? I mean, Iraq was a country invented pretty much by the British along lines that were not sustainable.
I think this will be the last question here. My question to two speakers: after all these years of silence, what has made you talk now rather than before?
Well, I've been talking about this since the first classification of those 28 pages. In fact, I was involved in getting 48 of the 50 senators within a matter of weeks of the withholding of those 28 pages to urge then President Bush to reverse that directive and release the 28 pages. So I've been at this for a long time. I think for a variety of reasons, particularly the chaos that is so apparent in the Middle East, we're starting to pay more attention today to events that were part of shaping the current chaos, such as 9/11 and the misguided war in Iraq. And so there's a broader audience, and I want to thank you again for coming tonight, interested in these issues and becoming more informed about them and understanding of their impact on our nation today.
And Bob, I understand, didn't you have when you had somebody in Lebanon that you were dealing with just at the end of your time there that sort of hinted that 9/11 was going to happen? Wasn't there a little bit of a sense that something was in the works?
I was in touch with one of the families of the hijackers, knew him from the Bekaa Valley. We all sort of knew attack like this was going to come. But frankly, I'm here to listen to Senator Graham because he knows what's in those pages, and if he says we have to see him, I believe that. And I've been talking about this intelligence, the manipulation of intelligence since the Iraq War. I know all the players there. I know how it was manipulated, and I think it's just unconscionable the way this was done. The CIA,
they all got promoted, right?
Everybody got promoted. I was close to the New York Times at the time. They covered up a lot of the things they knew about a revolt inside the CIA with the intelligence. It was never printed, and instead they put this nonsense, above the fold. And I just think it's, at the end of the day, we're all served by the truth.
Well, I thank both gentlemen for joining us tonight.